Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 103. Today's guest is Philipp Scholz Rittermann. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show. Today's guest is photographer Philipp Scholz Rittermann. Philipp Scholz Rittermann's work is held in over 100 public, private, and corporate collections from MoMA, New York to the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, France. Scholz Rittermann exhibits in national and international venues, and he was honored with a mid-career survey at the Museum of Photographic Art, San Diego, which published the monograph Navigating by Light. Scholz Rittermann has been teaching photography for over 30 years in the USA and abroad. I first met Philipp and saw his work at the inaugural Medium Festival of Photography back in 2012 when he was showing prints from his series Emperor's River, which was a series of panoramic photographs of China's Grand Canal. And I remember being struck by the scope of the images and the sense of motion in several of them. Since then, I've seen Philipp's work a number of times here and there around San Diego. We both live in the area. And most recently, again, at the Medium Festival this last year in 2019. This time, he was showing the series we're going to be talking about here, which is called Sight, Time, Memory, in which he photographs a landscape during the daytime, then returns to the same spot months later and at night, and uses a projector to project that original image onto the same landscape, and then rephotographs the resulting scene. It's visually striking, of course, but what really fascinated me about these images, and what you're going to hear us talking about, is how they play with time. Time, of course, is a fundamental part of photography, and it's one that photographic artists have been obsessed with for decades, and these images add to that conversation in ways that I really enjoyed. I've put a link in the show notes to where you can see some of these images online, but really the best way to see them is in person. And as it happens, if you're in the LA area on the day this episode airs, you have a chance to do that this very weekend. Philipp will have prints showing at the Photo LA Art Fair, which is at the Barker Hangar in Santa Monica from January 31st to February 2nd, 2020. And you can find prints and light boxes from Sight, Time, Memory shown by Quint Gallery in booth H05. Tickets to the art fair are $20 for a one-day ticket or $30 for a weekend pass. You can find all the information at photola.com, and there's a link in the show notes. Okay, let's get started. Here's my conversation with Philipp Scholz Rittermann. So, in prepping for this, I went and sort of looked around at some of the things that you had talked about, other coverage you'd had. And I found this a really interesting article in Black and White magazine from a few years ago talking about this series. But the intro was something that I really jumped out at me, was talking about this recurring dream that you had. Does this ring a bell to you?
Faintly, but go ahead.
Okay.
I'm sure I'll catch up.
So I'll read you the passage. This is the introductory passage. Some years ago, Philipp Rittermann had a recurring dream. Camera in hand, he traveled weightlessly through vivid landscapes in a state of exhilaration. The images he captured were nothing like he'd seen before. They were in 3D with continuous running time inside each frame. Knowing he was dreaming, he grabbed a handful of exposed film, hoping to bring it back to the tangible world. He invariably awoke with his hand clenched. It's interesting that little passage right there really opened up a lot for me in terms of understanding your work. I wanted to start.
No, it's relevant to what I'm still trying to do. So yes, that makes a lot of sense.
I wanted to start there.
Okay,
I wanted to start there. So do you recall this dream?
Yes. And the more often that I had the dream, the more I was aware that I wasn't going to be able to bring the images back. But, it was just still the effort to try to sort of see the impossible and make it not just visible in my own head, but make it visible for others to see. And it ties into what I'm really doing a lot more now, which is not just photographing the world as it appears to me, but trying to imagine what it would look like if my gaze were structured differently. If I could hold my gaze for hours, from day to night, from summer to winter, from the presence of something and the subsequent absence of it. And of course, we live in this moving target, this little gap in the curtain that is now. And it's a very, very short time. And what if I could open that gap in the curtain a little wider and have my gaze span, a longer period of time? And that really goes back to the old night work when I was photographing, out for hours, but it was a single exposure, sometimes hours long. You'd invariably have steam or water or star trails or something changing, looking very different to the way that one experiences it when one is there. I can be there for the whole 3-hour exposure and see everything that's occurred and remember some of it, but I'll never see the sum of everything that was displaced, that moved, that changed. And photography has this wonderful way of accruing everything that changed and then creating something that we can't see. So I like this sense of using photography as a way to see beyond my own senses, or in an expanded version of what my senses might be able to accomplish if my biology weren't structured the way it was, my sensorium were different. So the work that I'm doing now with the projections in the field of taking a summer image and then projecting that back onto the same subject in winter, and trying to synchronize the past image onto the present scene, that's an impossibility. Nobody can see that. If you have a summer image printed on a page next to or hanging on the wall next to a winter image of the same place, that's a very different kind of animal, because you have an A and a B and you get to compare and you go into an analytical sort of frame of mind. And I really like this idea of these things being merged and sitting on top of each other and kind of intertwined and inextricable and confusing each other. And I also think of it as the way that our memory kind of works, which is pretty much a layer cake, and the layers aren't very distinct. The longer the memory, the further away the memory is. They get compressed, the edges get knocked off, they get rewritten. Anyway, so that's kind of part of this dream, is to be able to see things that I just can't see, using photography to show me things that I can't experience.
Yeah.
It's no longer about just rendering the world as it appears to me. That train sort of left the station a long time ago.
So there was actually a lot of stuff in there that I did want to touch on, but just to sort of back up a little bit and talk about this new work. I saw this work at this year's Medium Festival that you had brought prints.
Okay, right. So you're caught up on that part.
Yeah, sort of. Unfortunately, I haven't seen them since October. It's January now.
Okay. Well, I have a couple of framed pieces here, so
yeah,
we can have a quick peek if you like.
Well, my recollection of these prints that you were showing, as you say, you're layering images. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but so the way that you are creating these images is that you're photographing a scene, a landscape scene, say, and then in one season, then coming back to the same place several months later, perhaps, but you bring a projector with you.
Right.
And you're actually making a large scale projection onto the real landscape of the original image, projected onto the landscape, and then photographing the projection on the real landscape.
Right. Rephotographing the whole event. So the photographs are actual documents of an event that occurred, an intervention in the landscape that occurred, but it's me just projecting the previous state onto that same subject, a rock formation, a tree, or whatever it is, in a different season, or just from daytime to nighttime. Of course, the projections have to happen at night, because I wouldn't be able to get the image to show up with sunlight, or even on a full moon night, the images get washed out. The projected images get washed out. But it is important for me to know, for people to know, that these are not sandwiched together in Photoshop. This is not an after the fact manipulation. These are, projections that occur in the field. And they're
why is that an important thing for this project?
Because it's a way to make it visible in a way that it's impossible, really, to have our gaze straddling daytime to nighttime or summer to winter. That's something we can't do. We have to use some sort of device to make that happen. I don't really like the notion of making it an artificial a simulation of, like an artist's rendition of what a supernova looks like. I'd rather actually see the supernova. So this is something that I'm witnessing as I'm standing there. And nature doesn't often provide a perfect screen. Nature is boulders and rocks and stuff, and I'm projecting onto that. If I'm standing directly behind the projector and photographing with my camera set up directly above and behind the projector, I get an almost perfect rectangular projection within an otherwise, darker surrounding sort of nightscape. But the minute you step off axis, you get all these other artifacts occurring where the image tears because there's shadows and obstructions. And so you've got the lighting direction of the daytime image from the past, which might be the sun over your left shoulder. You've got the direction of the light being projected by the projector, which is casting its own shadows. And then you've got whatever ambient light is occurring, perhaps some weak moonlight or something like that. So it's like living in a world with multiple stars or suns. I mean, again, trying to get at something that I can't see for myself with my own two eyes. But here, with the help of a projector, I'm actually looking at it and able to photograph it. In the end, it's a single capture that I have to sometimes dodge and burn on the projected image, because the part that's putting light onto the area that's directly in front of the projector is, of course, getting a lot more exposure than the far background, which could be hundreds of feet away. I also like that it brings to bear sort of everything I know about photography, the skills that I learned in the darkroom to try to get, manage my highlights and shadows and local burning and dodging of a print. Well, this is sort of a reverse darkroom out in the world at night, and the image was captured coming into the camera and then replicated back out onto the world with a lens. So it's lens-based, both coming in and going out. I don't know if that matters to anyone else but me, but it's important to me that that's how it occurs.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I could just, harvest images off of Google and mash them up in Photoshop and never leave my couch.
Right.
And I'm not interested in that.
Yeah. I guess one of the things I'm kind of interested in is, if I sort of expand it a little bit, I sort of tend to think of art as being an experience that the artist is creating for the audience. There's not really a good definition of art, but maybe that's one sort of thing that I often think about, right? But when I'm thinking about that, right, when I'm thinking about what's important to the artist in the creation of the work, there's often the question for me whether, and this is especially the case, not only with photography, but especially photography, whether what's important is the final artifact itself, or that you have documented an experience that you were having in that moment. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's not that easy to answer, because ultimately something that matters to me may not be visible to the viewer, ergo also not necessarily important to them. How much of this effort that goes into making these images is actually visible in the final print? Not a whole lot. The thing I'm after is first to hook you into looking, right? And once you start looking, thinking you know what you're looking at, realizing you don't, because there are all these clues in there that, well, if this was just a double exposure, then how come that bit of image is hung up on those tree limbs in the corner? And there's a shadow of that part projected into the space later. There are all these artifacts that the process produces that if you dialogue with the work long enough, you'll figure it out. And I prize ambiguity in images a lot. I don't want them to be quick reads. We live in a world where we swipe images at about a second interval. You kind of go through and swipe. Images that work under those circumstances have to be a quick read. There probably aren't very many layers in them, and it's sort of instant, and it comes and goes very quickly. It's sort of forgettable. In this world of an increasingly diminished attention span that we have for still images, I'm trying to create images that will hold your attention for a while, that the longer you look, the more questions you'll have, and hopefully it's an enjoyable experience and you get to discover it on your own terms. So your original question was about how important this is for others to know. It's not that important. I guess I'd draw the line at, I want people to know that these are real projections and that in the end it's a single capture that brought back this image. And I'm hoping that they'll engage, the viewer will engage and kind of go, what the hell is this and how did it come about? And hopefully it's enjoyable and gets them to think about time, our place in the flow of time, the way we experience it. You were talking about what art is, what can it be? I think one of the things that art can do when it's successful is get us to think differently than we've thought about a particular subject before. If that's what I can get to, then I think I'm doing something good, right? If I can get somebody to reconsider their perceptions. I mean, I think a lot about, does color exist? The whole world is made up of materials that absorb some frequencies and reflect back out others. What we make of that in our mind's eye is color, but otherwise color doesn't actually exist as a thing.
Yeah.
So these are the sort of rabbit holes that I go down, and then it's like, well, what does that mean? And can I do something with it? And if I could hold my gaze for 6 months, what could that look like? What would that make the world look like? And I'm sure it would look really different than the pictures I'm currently making. Yeah. But this is my closest attempt,
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting what you're describing as sort of the experience of decoding a certain visual puzzle on the part of the audience. I remember when you had your prints out on the table, in the lobby of the Lafayette, having that sort of moment of, so this looks like a double exposure. Well, wait a second. What about that? And what about that?
Right.
And I never like to reduce anyone's art to just like figuring out a puzzle, right? I think that's...
But I think we can't help ourselves. I mean, it happens a lot. I know I do it.
Yeah.
It's an occupational hazard.
I guess it's true. But, like, for example, I remember I had the photographer, Chris Engman on the show. And are you familiar with this?
Yes,
work?
very.
Yeah.
And I think he's working an area that I'm also kind of engaged in, his solutions are very different, but he's also working on that ambiguous, taking ambiguity to different levels and creating images that are nigh on impossible.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And I remember when I talked to him, I sort of proposed that his pictures were sort of puzzles. And he sort of pushed back on that a little bit. He said, I'm happy for people to engage with that aspect of them, but what he's really trying to do is elicit some kind of emotional response from his audience. What I find interesting about that puzzle aspect of not all art does that, right? Not all art brings that aspect of experience to the audience. But what I find is that, I guess what I'm interested in is this question of process, right?
Well, that's kind of what I'd like to hook in on, because the figuring out the puzzle part, if we just want to condense that, is just one aspect of it. When you get to it, the why of it, like, why is this important to this artist? What are they actually trying to get at? I mean, that's what gets you into the dialogue,
right.
And to think about the larger issues, the undercurrents or the underpinnings of what makes this work happen.
Right. I remember once I was, it was an online sort of discussion thread that this author, Daniel Abraham, who I've also had on the show a while back, was having, in the comments of a blog post that he had written. And he's a science fiction writer, fantasy writer. He proposed this idea that obscurity, and granted, he's approaching this as a writer, not a visual artist, but his proposition that he wanted everybody to discuss was obscurity in the work is either a mark of an execution of a failure of execution in craft, or an expression of contempt for the audience on the part of the artist, which I kind of, I'm not sure about that. Where this led for me was in saying, what kind of experience am I trying to craft for the audience? And in some cases, there are certain kinds of experiences you can have in art that you can only have if the text of it is kind of obscure and requires the audience or reader to do some kind of work in order to meet the art where it is, you know?
Yeah. I like to think of this as underneath it all, it's inclusive. What I'm trying to do is inclusive. It's not exclusive, in that I would like to play with others in considering these subjects. And, you know, what I'm throwing on the table is like, let's discuss this. You know, I'd like to, don't you also think about time sometimes? And how do you think about it? And how does it manifest for you? I like to think of these as conversation starters, not trying to be deliberately obscure or abstruse or exclusive.
Well, just to be clear,
you know?
like, I don't find your images to be like intentionally obscure, but what I'm interested in is, you know, if there is that aspect where I, as the viewer, can't help trying to puzzle it out, you know, that's part of the experience.
Yeah.
Right?
And it's intentional, and I'd like it to, because otherwise it's also sort of, it's such a quick read that it falls into that instantly forgettable, no loose ends, next, you know, category. And I photograph artwork for a living. I mean, I document artwork for artists and institutions and a whole range of things, from installation art to conceptual stuff to, you know, oil paintings. And so I look at a lot of art and I think about art a lot. And I really enjoy the ones that present themselves as a conundrum or a question, or invite you to figure something out for yourself, that don't explain themselves too readily. Those are the ones that hold my attention.
Right.
Same goes for books and movies and conversations I've had where all of the loose ends are not tied up. The question remains open. You know, that's the kind of stuff that interests me more than anything. And that's actually what I'm also trying to craft with my own work.
Right.
You know?
So it's sort of going back to where we started with this, talking about that dream again.
Yeah.
One of the things that really struck me when I was thinking about that is sort of the difference between the desire and result. Right. Because the way that, at least the way it's written in this article, right, there's this sort of platonic ideal almost of like, this is what I would like to achieve.
Right.
Versus then I wake up and this is what my tools are able to do.
Right. And okay, I've been trying to expand that tool set my whole life, right? Always trying to, well, what if I did this? I wonder what that would look like, you know, and it's this constant back and forth of trying to incorporate other devices or artifices to try to get at these unsolvable problems.
Yeah. I have this real fascination with, there's a friend of mine who has another show. It's called WMFA, and she talks to writers about how and why they write. And, the last thing she always asks everybody is, what does creative satisfaction look like to them? Which I find such an interesting idea, because the title of this show comes from this Martha Graham quotation, where Martha Graham was basically saying, there's no such thing as creative satisfaction. Then
it's done, right? Yeah. If you actually are fully satisfied, then it's over. Like the question is answered, you're finished.
Yeah. And I'm interested in this thing. So, you know, if we have, you know, for your own work, if we have this sort of feeling of something that I'm trying to accomplish this thing, as I expand, the tools can't quite reach what it is that I was dreaming of, that I can see how that leads to a motivation to continue to improve and innovate and things like that. But because we can never quite get there.
What constitutes success?
Yeah. Like, when you look at your own work, does it feel, when I look at my work, most of the time, honestly, what I'm thinking of is all the ways that it didn't do the things that I was hoping it would do.
Ditto.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not showing you any of the other, you know, the vast numbers of failures. Though nobody will ever see those.
It's not just the failures that you're not showing, right? Like for me, even the ones that I do show people, right? Like I've gotten these projects to a point where I'm comfortable at least showing them to people.
Yeah. I think success, broadly speaking, success is when you put it up on the wall and people engage and you're seeing them grappling with it and enjoying themselves and talking excitedly amongst themselves and looking at it again and then stepping back and then kind of realizing that they were on the wrong track before and that maybe it's something else. And it's like, that to me is quite successful, because these are open questions. There's no right or final answer. And if the images are visually stimulating and engaging, then, and they hold someone's attention for a while, then I think I'm succeeding for the moment. Mm. It could be that 5 years from now, I'll think that it's all rubbish and I've moved on to something else. But I think we're lucky as artists if we can figure out a question that sustains us for a long time. Mm. Not that we ever really want to fully answer it, but having a good question that has multiple spin-offs, that you can go down 3 or 4 rabbit holes at the same time. And as you go along, you stumble across things that bring up more questions. That's perfect, because the fuel for all of this stuff is curiosity. And if you lose that curiosity, then you've pretty much finished,
Yeah. Well, that actually seems like not a terrible place to wrap the first segment. So why don't we take a little break and then we'll do the second segment.
Okay.
So for the second segment, I always invite the guest to bring a topic of their own, which could be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever happens to be on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
Yeah, well, I was thinking about it quite a bit, and for me, it's the disappearing of the hand in the making of things, and even in the, not just making of objects, but how we use our hands used to be to write letters, to form objects, to create things. And a lot of that is being taken over by mechanization and digitization. I mean, I can see it in my own handwriting, my cursive handwriting. Maybe it's just a function of getting older, but it's horrible. It's chicken scratch. So I have to write in capital letters to have something legible anymore, which would have been, I think, unacceptable 100 years ago if I was handwriting my letters to family or friends and I was using all caps. They would have thought I was screaming at them the whole time, So, and it's not just, hearkening back to the old days nostalgia. I think we're just living this moment. I've been around the planet, for more than 60 years. I'm seeing something dramatically change from the way it was done when I was raised to how it is now. And I think it's worth noting. For instance, with handwriting, I learned cursive. My handwriting was never high grade, but it was decent. There's a style and an expression to that is really your personal font, right? And I can probably decipher an A written by hand 1,000 different ways. I can still make it out somehow. But as we get into just mechanically or digitally reproduced type that we read, our ability to decipher someone's handwriting is going to fall away because we're just not used to seeing it anymore. I think that also is partly why I like mechanical watches, old mechanical watches, and I like fixing stuff with my hands. And I don't know how important that is in general, but it's something that I'm just, I'm noticing. And, if I had the option of buying a beautiful cup that is extruded by a CNC type driven machine or one that's handcrafted with a beautiful glaze on it, I'd probably go for the latter.
Yeah.
Even if it's a little lumpier and not as perfect as the machine extruded one, but I just prize, good craftsmanship and things like that. And I think that's disappearing.
I think, it's interesting. I'm a bit younger than you are. So I'm 40 years old. Mm-hmm. I think when you get to be around my age, a lot of people tend to find themselves, this is the age when people start having midlife crises and things like that. I always wonder what mine will look like. I suppose it's possible this podcast is what mine looks like.
Not exactly a red Ferrari, so I think you're okay.
Yeah. But I think that there is often this thing where you reach a certain stage of life and you really start taking note more of the passage of time. Mm-hmm. And that can come with all different kinds of anxieties. And
sure.
I is something that I do find fascinating to view both in myself and in other people. I think it's really, I started noticing this in my peers actually surprisingly a lot longer ago than I would have thought. People expressing a certain anxiety about what have we lost or how have things changed. And I do find that to be very natural and understandable.
Yeah, I think it's how we roll. I mean, change is hard for us, right?
Yeah.
And things that happened to my grandparents were also disconcerting when they noticed the world around them changing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to stay out of the just straight up nostalgia for things. I actually refer to the film days as the bad old film days because I'm so glad I'm not having to deal with chemistry and pollution at that level to make my work. I also really enjoy the precision and the, sort of the excellent machinery that we have at our disposal now to make our work, both in the capture part and the reproduction part. You know, printers and cameras now compared to 20, 30 years ago are fantastically more advanced. So I don't want a handmade camera. Don't get me wrong. If I really want to know what time it is, I don't look at my old mechanical watches. I pick up my iPhone and look at what time it is, right?
Yeah.
So, but I do wonder about what is being lost. I mean, that's just, I think, a natural part of how we deal with change. We have to kind of reconcile what we're heading towards and look at the benefits of it and hopefully try to hang on to something that is worth hanging on to of what we know.
I had this a similar conversation with Robert Calafiore, and he was on the show, I want to say in the fall.
Mm-hmm. I haven't listened to that one yet, but I like
one.
his work a lot.
I do too.
Yeah.
And he has had a similar thing that he wanted to talk about, which was, he has noticed that, he teaches at University of Hartford.
I had that conversation with him.
Yes.
And that his students don't even know how to use a straight edge.
Right.
Stuff like that, right?
Yeah, this was part of actually his lecture at Medium this past, or I guess this would have been the year before last.
Yeah.
One of the things that I find really interesting, I cannot argue with, I mean, if this is an observation that he has made, that his students are less skilled than they used to be in using their hands, that's something that I can't argue with.
Right.
You know, that's data that he's collected.
Yeah.
But it's also sort of at odds with a different phenomenon that I've noticed, which is that I have noticed in a lot of younger artists a real fascination with sort of more old-fashioned ways
analog
of doing
processes.
things. Yeah. Analog processes, historical processes, tintypes for photography, things like that, albumin prints.
Well, it's new to them, right?
Yeah. But it's not just
exotic.
new. It's not just that it's exotic. I think that that there is this very consciously historical aspect to it for a lot of these younger people. You know, everybody makes fun of millennials. I think I said this same exact phrase to him when he was on the show, but everybody makes fun of millennials for their artisanal pickles and their, farm to table, whatever, right?
Craft beers, the whole works.
Right.
Yeah.
What I find so interesting about that, having had a little bit more time to think about it, is, for somebody like you or me we're not millennials, right? We're not in that coming up thing. We can look back at stuff like that and say, well, this is just how it was.
Right.
When we came up, when I first started learning photography, we did do darkroom and digital cameras weren't a thing yet.
Right. I thought it was a fad.
Yeah. Whereas for younger people now, if you're maybe 10, 15 years younger than me, if you're in your mid-20s right now, you really wouldn't have come up at a time when digital wasn't a thing.
Right. You're a digital native.
Right. So what I find fascinating about it is, for you or me, if we're looking to the past, it would be a nostalgic thing, right? It would be a thing about memory at some level, right? Or preservation perhaps. But if you're much younger than I am, it can't be about that.
No.
Because you never experienced it the first time.
It's like reconstituting of an historical process, really.
I think that's fascinating.
Yeah.
I think that's really interesting.
But do you think that might be coming about because of the lack of tangibility in what is common process now? That everything occurs on a keyboard and a mouse and a screen, and then you may actually print 3D or 2D something out of your work, but you weren't involved in the direct making of it, and that this gives you, a younger person who's not had this kind of alchemical experience of being in a dark room and getting your fingers wet and seeing an image come up, not because it's being laid down by a laser or a print head, line by line, but the whole image is emerging through a chemical process. I imagine that's quite magical.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's what we all talk about, that memory of the first time we see the print coming in, the developer.
Yeah. It is kind of magical.
It is.
But I think it might be a desire for something more tangible.
Yeah.
When you're day to day, everything's involved. Our lives are just controlled by screens at this point, right?
Mm-hmm.
We interact with the information on them. We generate information for them. We share our information back and forth through them. It's this screen-based existence. And here's something that's physical, this material that has to be kept dark, that has to be put into a camera and exposed properly and taken out and processed, like physically handled. And then you come up with this image that's awesome.
Yeah. I'm not sure exactly what it is that, I'm not enough of a sociologist or psychologist to know, but what I do notice is that more than this was true to a certain degree of people when I was younger, my generation, and I think that there were occurrence of this in every generation, but I think that the generation after me, more than anybody I know my age or older, has a real fascination with the idea of authenticity.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is a really interesting question. Like, what does authenticity mean?
What is authenticity? Yeah. It's like that's a moving target depending on what generation you're part of.
Yeah. Not just what generation you're part of, but, I don't know, epistemologically or ontologically, like what does authentic mean? Like from whence does this quality proceed? It's a question I don't think anybody really answers satisfactorily, but it's something that I wonder what it is for younger people that drives that fascination with authenticity. Because for myself, I almost often feel like authenticity is a little bit of a trap.
Well, I was just going to say it could be a nostalgic trap.
Yeah.
And it's something that's sort of sentimentally overburdened, and that is what authenticity looks like to some of us, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas there's no question that you can have 100% digital content be authentic.
Right.
It's not nostalgic.
Right.
It can look nostalgic, but it's still digital from start to finish, and it can be completely authentic. So I think it's a tricky word. Some of my photography colleagues who harken back to the good old film days, I'm not one of them, use things like film is more truthful or it has more soul. And I hate those words applied to this because that's sentimental rubbish to me. It's just anthropomorphizing or something, putting qualities into a material. It's just celluloid with a coating of chemistry. How is that any more or less truthful than a sensor capturing information through that same lens? If you set the bar at not manipulating more than exposure and, overall tonality and contrast, you can do that in analog world as well as in digital world. The images gathered on a sensor versus a piece of film treated with the same kind of set of standards are equivalent in terms of their authenticity. So I think there's a confusion of terms there. It feels more authentic. It's sort of like it's more truthy or something like that. But when you really peel it apart, it's like, what is really the fascination with those old processes? What is it for younger people now discovering these processes and using them for themselves? What really drives that?
Yeah.
It's interesting because I can't know.
Yeah. I'm thinking a bit about this question that you've raised and like you're describing, I tend to lean more in the direction of being, if not always excited, at least interested and often excited to find out what new things are going to be happening, and I do try to avoid or resist the nostalgic impulse or the impulse to say that things were definitely better before, because I think there is a way that memory tends to operate to filter things, and
definitely,
and I think it's unquestionable that the changes in our tools and the changes in the ways that we understand and interact with the world individually and collectively certainly has an effect on what kinds of work are made and what work is made about. And I think that's, depending on your point of view, is either anxiety-inducing or excitement-inducing, sometimes both at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's my experience.
But, I'm going to back up a little bit.
Okay.
Maybe a month or two ago, Martin Scorsese wrote this op-ed. I don't know if you read it or...
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. And he was talking about the state of the film industry now versus what it was like when he was coming up. Mm-hmm. And I thought the responses to that were interesting because they tended to fall into two very opposite camps, I found. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, many people, and not just older people either, even younger people, many people looked at what Scorsese was saying, sort of decrying the industrial commercialization and businessification of the film industry, moving away from individual auteurship. Mm-hmm. And they said, you know what, he's really right. He's really talking about something that's awful in the film industry right now. And then other people took what he was saying and said, oh, whatever, old man kind of thing. And
well, it's both, isn't it?
It is what I don't want to get too much into the specifics of it. For me personally, I think, there's a real interesting undercurrent of disdain for fantastic and speculative genres that has always run through narrative art, which I think is a little undeserved because, if you go back, even the Epic of Gilgamesh, we were dealing with heroism and people have found value and narrative resonance and things like that for thousands and thousands of years. But, without getting too much into that part.
Well, I just want to interject that there's always been commercial drivel in film, even back in the good old days, right? So there's always been a range of output. Mm-hmm. But go ahead.
Well, my initial response when I read that piece was I was more towards the okay, just get over it kind of thing. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting is sort of reading some of the more thoughtful responses, because obviously the internet is what it is, so people are not always engaging thoughtfully.
Right.
I don't necessarily know that it's true that auteurship is necessarily evaporating from the world.
Oh,
I don't think it is.
No.
But I can see where it's not supported by the studios to the same degree as it might have been.
But that's not news. That's, I think, always been the case. I mean, look at Alfonso Cuarón's Roma last year. And look at some of the blockbuster movies that he had done before, which were, kind of gag-worthy. I mean, very commercial, full of sentimental tropes, vast production values, going into a not very interesting storyline in some cases. But then he took that capital, both in terms of his reach in Hollywood and his access to incredible resources, and he made Roma.
Yeah.
Which to me was like, it's a revelation. That film should be taught in every film class from here on out, and that was proper auteurship.
Right. I think what Scorsese's complaint was not that, great films aren't being made, but just that the budgets that quote unquote auteur films are able to.
They're always a fraction of what the big blockbusters get.
It's true. But then when you compare something like, I don't know, The Godfather, was given a lot more resources than something like Roma was. And what I was thinking about in this, sort of maybe leaving aside the question of whether or not he's factually correct about these things, because I think that what's more interesting about it is the emotional correctness of it.
Well, that's what's true for him, for sure, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, you wouldn't have such a big point to make.
Right. And I thought to myself, change is inevitable. And if you are lucky enough to live a long time, it's sort of inevitable that you're going to see something that you valued very deeply go away.
Yeah.
And I think that's got to have been true for the entirety of human history, that every generation sees that, whether it's on just a personal level of, losing people that you love or on a bigger sort of more societal, cultural level. But I think that that's
environmental.
Yeah.
We're witnessing some dramatic shifts now that, seem irrecuperable.
Mm-hmm. I think that there is a tendency especially among younger people, to look at that response from older people and who are inevitably have to cope with that kind of loss, and to sort of write it off as just old people being old people. Mm-hmm. And it does occur to me, maybe this is just because I am myself getting older now, that there is, even though I want to fight against that nostalgic impulse, that there is something really and truly authentic about that sense of loss, that there is a grief to it.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
That is just as real as if you lose a person in your life. Mm-hmm. It's not the same feeling, but it's not completely dissimilar. And I'm finding myself more and more sympathetic to, if not necessarily the conclusions that some people draw that say, well, we have to go back. But at least of the process of grieving the loss, Well, the perspective changes a lot when you realize that the time ahead of you is a whole lot shorter than the time behind you. And you're sort of reaching, I don't know, maybe a midpoint. Yeah. I don't know how the longevity of the genes in your family are, but, that's kind of a moment where you kind of look at you're in this moment, and I'm certainly looking at a whole lot less time in front than behind. And it changes how you evaluate everything. I never thought about how much time I had left when I was in my 20s or 30s. It just never occurred to me because it seemed endless. And now that's, top of mind. So, I think when you describe it as grief, that's real. I feel that about, the environment. There are things that I saw that people being born now will never see. Especially growing up in South America, there's all sorts of change happening there, desertification in certain areas, and, just rampant pollution in the Amazon and things like that, which you can't recover that, not in our lifetimes. That's a deep sense of grief that I have for how we are changing the planet. Nothing nostalgic about that, I don't think. No.
But, so how did we get here?
You know what? We are actually getting pretty close to time. But there is one question that I like to end with.
Okay.
And that is if there is a piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
Well, I just recently watched that Southern Italian series, My Brilliant Friend.
Oh.
And it was so powerful. Portraying, 50s, 60s, Southern Italy suburb of Palermo, and these two girls growing up, lifelong friends, rivals. But the storytelling was so powerful, and it was all spoken in Southern Italian with subtitles. The acting of the young versions of these two women, girls in their preteens, was so amazing. I just, it's been with me since we finished watching it 2 weeks ago, and I can't get it out of my head. I mean, it was so good.
Yeah.
Fantastic storytelling.
I had forgotten that there had been an adaptation of it. I read the book.
Yeah.
I've only read the first book. There's 4 of them.
Yeah.
But I read the book, I want to say maybe in 2018.
Okay.
By Elena Ferrante.
Right.
Yeah, just amazing. Amazing storytelling.
So powerful.
Yeah.
And it, the place is important, of course, for that story. Talk about feeling authentic. But the human story is kind of universal. I could see that happening almost anywhere, especially when you have a steep socioeconomic slope with very few at the top and most everybody else, fending for themselves at the bottom.
Yeah.
Just clawing their way into the middle. Yeah. I mean, it's really fascinating.
And isn't it just so interesting? It's certainly the book, it's so specific to a place and time, even down to just the discussion of language, using dialect versus higher Italian forms, was in many ways that story could not exist at any other place or time. And yet it is, by being so specific,
It's
so
universal.
universally understandable.
Yeah.
I really have to get back and read the rest of that series.
Yeah. We're going to be reading the books because it was such a powerful story.
Yeah. I only wish that I were able to read it in Italian.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Well, speaking Spanish, it helps me decipher words here and there, but the accent is so thick. I mean, with Northern Italian, I do a little better, but with Southern Italian, I was really grasping. But it didn't matter.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Well, I did too, Mike. Thanks for taking the time and wanting to talk.
Okay, as I mentioned at the top of the show, if you're in the LA area, you can see some of Philipp's work in the Quint Gallery booth, that's booth H05, at the Photo LA Art Fair this coming weekend, January 31st to February 2nd, 2020. Do be sure to check that out. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode was done by me, the music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help on this episode is by Shea Aguinaldo. You can find all of the show's social media information, transcripts, email newsletter, and show notes at keepthechannelopen.com. And if you'd like to support the show, you can make a pledge to our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/likewisemedia. A $5 monthly pledge gets you access to our bonus audio archive, which includes readings from guests of Keep the Channel Open and interviews with the authors of Likewise Fiction. Coming up next week on Likewise Fiction, I'll be reading Chaya Bhuvaneshwar's story, The Story of the Woman Who Fell in Love with Death, which blends legend and contemporary fiction to tell a story about an Indian-American family, domestic abuse, and a sister who goes missing. That airs on February 3rd, and you can find that at likewisefiction.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Keep the Channel Open will be back on February 12th with a conversation with YA author Lilium Rivera, so do be sure to come back for that one. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.